There are few things in life more surreal than sipping coffee on your porch, watching the sunrise, only to have a mud-covered ATV roar across your private pasture and nearly collide with your prized goat. That was the moment I dropped my mug in shock, blinked twice, and saw the horror that was Karen, blonde bob flapping in the wind, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and a look of absolute entitlement as she kicked up a storm of dust and cow manure across my ranch. She didn't flinch, didn't wave, just powered through the trail like it belonged to her. The real kicker? She was blasting country music so loud it startled my chickens into a full-on rebellion. And that was only the first lap. By the third, my livestock had fled to the barn, my dog had hidden under the truck, and I realized this wasn't just some one-time idiocy. No, this was a declaration of war. I had bought the ranch to escape noise, people, and HOA nonsense. My property bordered the back end of a fancy suburban development whose residents occasionally wandered too close, but most were harmless. Until Karen moved in. She wasn't just a resident. She was the self-declared HOA president, lawmaker, and judge rolled into one. She saw her neighbors as peasants and treated everything within eyeshot as her kingdom. When she discovered the dirt trail behind her backyard, my trail, mind you, she must have imagined it was some untapped extension of her estate. And without so much as a knock on my door, she began using it. That first day, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she didn't know. So I calmly walked up to the edge of her property, knocked, and greeted her politely. She barely cracked the door and peered out like I was trying to sell vacuum cleaners. I introduced myself and mentioned the trail was private and not open to motor vehicles. Her response was a smirk. Then she said, and I quote, "That trail is more useful to me than to you. My ATV needs space, and your cows can share." Then she shut the door in my face. Just like that. No room for conversation. My jaw actually dropped, and I stood there for a full minute, trying to process what just happened. That weekend, she brought friends. 2 more ATVs tore through the trail like it was a racetrack. They didn't just spook the livestock. They knocked over a feeder, trampled part of the irrigation system, and clipped a gate post. I installed a sign. Private property. No ATV access. Violators will be prosecuted. The next morning, I found it flattened under a tire. Right beside it, someone had dumped an empty latte cup and half a sandwich. Karen had turned my trail into her picnic circuit. At that point, I documented everything. I set up trail cams. I wrote a formal cease and desist. I even reached out to the HOA to inform them of her behavior. The response? A letter from the HOA itself, signed by Karen, claiming that the trail access dispute had been resolved and that I was expected to remove dangerous animals from what they now claimed was a shared recreational corridor. I nearly burst out laughing. Dangerous animals? My pigs barely get off their backs unless they smell peaches. And my cows are so chill they nap during thunderstorms. But none of that mattered to Karen. She had decided the trail was hers, and that was final. I tried installing a wooden gate. Reinforced it with steel mesh. It lasted 48 hours. I came out one morning to find the lock mechanism smashed, the hinges bent, and tire tracks cutting through a fresh batch of hay I just laid out. Next to the damage? A sparkling pink hair clip. Karen had left her calling card. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I had tried being polite. I had tried being reasonable. But as anyone who's raised hogs knows, sometimes the only language that gets through is mud, stink, and chaos. And I had plenty of all three. I began working late into the night. I rerouted the trail slightly, angling it through a part of the ranch no outsider would dare tread. The pig enclosure. But not just any part. This was the muddiest, most pungent, most frequently fertilized area of my land. A place so legendary that my nephews called it the stank zone. The pigs loved it. Tourists did not. I fortified the path, installed a few guiding reflectors, and camouflaged the stink trail to make it seem like a smoother, faster option. If Karen wanted speed, I'd give her speed, with a scent she'd never forget. I also made sure my pigs were well fed and in a social mood. I planted melon slices near the trail's curve, watered down the path with extra slop buckets, reinforced the fencing around the rest of the trail so Karen would have no choice but to follow the new path. Meanwhile, I left the original signage up, knowing full well she'd ignore it. That was part of the fun. Karen didn't just like trespassing, she needed to feel like she was outsmarting someone. All I had to do was bait the trap, and she'd drive herself right into it. 2 days later, I heard the familiar roar of engines. This time, it wasn't just her. She'd brought her HOA board member friend, Rick, the one who thought wearing loafers on a ranch made him sophisticated. They came barreling down the trail, yelling something about property freedom. I stood by the barn with binoculars, coffee in hand, and watched as their tires hit the new curve. I could almost hear the confusion when they hit the first puddle of sludge. Then came the sound I'll never forget, high-pitched screeches as ATVs sank half a foot into pig muck. The pigs, curious and excited by the watermelon rinds, came rushing over. Karen's shrieks echoed across the valley. Rick tried to reverse. Bad idea. One of the pigs must have thought his back tire was a chew toy and started headbutting it. Karen dropped her phone into the slop trying to record a video. They were stuck. And I mean stuck. The kind where the engine wheezes, the wheels spin in vain, and the riders start debating whether to abandon ship. I kept watching, and smiling, and sipping my coffee. No ranchers ever had a better morning. But that wasn't the end. Oh no. Karen was far from done, and so was I. What happened next would turn this petty ATV war into a full-scale scandal that even her pristine HOA couldn't sweep under the carpet. The trail battle had just begun, and this pigsty ambush was only the opening shot. Karen didn't show up for 2 days after the pigsty incident. I half expected her to send a cleaning bill or maybe show up with the sheriff and a poorly rehearsed sob story. But instead, silence. No engines. No signs. No fresh tire tracks. It was so quiet that even the pigs started loitering by the trail again, hoping for another watermelon ambush. I started to think maybe, just maybe, she'd gotten the message. That hope lasted exactly until Thursday afternoon, when I heard a low rumble building from the edge of the property. This time, it wasn't one ATV. It was 4. I stepped out onto the porch and there they were. Karen in front, helmet off so her hair could flap dramatically in the breeze, followed by 3 new recruits from the HOA board, one of whom was wearing a GoPro strapped to his head like this was some Red Bull event. I didn't even bother shouting. I just turned on the trail cam and hit record. They weren't coming to apologize or negotiate. They were doubling down. Karen had even installed little decorative flags on the back of the ATVs. Pink ones, with the HOA's logo on them like this was some sort of entitled cavalry charge. They didn't use the main trail anymore. Karen had decided the new route through the pigsty was now the official scenic path. She posted about it on the HOA Facebook group, complete with a bragging caption about her adventurous spirit and a picture of her caked in mud, smiling like a reality TV contestant. Apparently, her humiliation had been spun into a badge of honor. According to the post, she'd discovered a new recreational opportunity for the community. Her HOA friends chimed in, praising her courage and even asking if she planned to host trail rides every weekend. One woman asked if kids could bring mini dirt bike. It was absurd. She had trespassed, gotten herself stuck in hog waste, and now she was trying to turn it into a community event. But things got worse. Much worse. That evening, I found a fresh letter stuffed in my mailbox, this time on HOA letterhead. It was a notice of violation against me. The accusations ranged from negligent containment of aggressive livestock to unauthorized barriers on shared trail access. It ended with a fine. A real one. Signed by Karen. I stared at the letter for a solid minute before laughing out loud. She had fined me for her own trespassing adventure. That was when I knew I wasn't dealing with a nuisance. I was dealing with a full-blown delusional empire builder. I called the sheriff's department. I knew a deputy, Vince, who used to help me out during rodeo season. He came by, read the HOA letter, and laughed so hard he nearly dropped his radio. But even he had to admit it was tricky. The HOA had no jurisdiction on my land, but they were smart about their wording. They weren't demanding entry. They were fining me for uncooperative neighborhood behavior. Vince told me I had two choices. One, I could lawyer up and go through the slow grind of getting them off my back. Or two, I could give them enough rope to hang themselves. That gave me an idea. If Karen wanted to act like she had legal access, I'd give her exactly what she asked for, but on my terms. I redesigned the trail again. This time, I made it more elaborate. I laid down fresh hay in the clean section to bait her away from the original pig path. Then I added a shallow trench just beyond it, filled it with leftover fertilizer mix, and covered it with camo netting. Beyond that, I set up a makeshift checkpoint with a wooden stand and a trail camera mounted overhead. I painted a rustic sign that read, in friendly cursive letters, Karen's Express Lane, VIP only. I knew she wouldn't resist it. The pigs? They were getting used to the commotion. I started feeding them at random intervals along different parts of the trail, and they began associating ATV noise with snack. One particularly clever piglet I named Duke had started waiting near the edge of the path like a scout. Every time an engine revved, he perked up and trotted along the fence like he was monitoring traffic. I gave Duke a little bell collar just for fun. It jingled every time he moved, and that bell would play a critical role later. By the next weekend, Karen launched what she called her Saturday HOA Trail Parade. She brought 7 people this time. 2 kids. 1 guy with a cooler strapped to his back. It looked like a picnic on wheels. They wore matching shirts that read HOA Trailblazers. The GoPro guy was back, and this time he had a drone. They filmed everything, cheered every time they hit a bump, and even shouted "Yeehaw" at one point. Karen waved to my trail cams like she was filming a campaign ad. I watched from the barn with binoculars, marveling at how much effort she was putting into invading someone else's property. Then they hit the trench. The first rider, Karen, made it across with a bounce, but the second ATV went nose first into the muck. The driver, a teenager with more confidence than skill, flipped over the handlebars and landed in the fertilizer soup. Karen slammed on the brakes and shouted at him to walk it off. The kid tried, but the smell was overwhelming. People started gagging. The pigs, curious as ever, came trotting over. Duke led the way, bell jingling like some herald of chaos. The parade scattered. One woman tried backing up but turned too sharply and rolled into a pile of slop. Another got off her ATV and started screaming about the health code. Karen tried to rally them, yelling that this was all just part of the rustic charm, but nobody was buying it anymore. The man with the drone lost control, and it crashed into a feed bucket, splashing sour mash all over his khakis. The GoPro caught everything. I walked over slowly, wiping my hands with a rag and tipping my hat. Karen stormed up to me, mud dripping from her arms, and screamed, "You planned this! This is sabotage!" I looked at the sign beside her and pointed. It clearly read, "Warning, active livestock area. Enter at your own risk." I gestured to the drone footage, the warning signs, the fence line she had crossed, and reminded her that everything was being recorded. She snapped something about lawyers and turned to leave, but not before slipping one more time and falling knee-deep into Duke's favorite wallow. That night, her HOA post was different. No pictures. No adventure quotes. Just a vague complaint about environmental hazards and irresponsible livestock owners. The comments section turned against her. People started asking why the HOA was even involved with private property. Someone else asked where the money for the trail flags and shirts had come from. One brave neighbor posted a clip from the drone footage showing Karen waving like a queen as she crossed onto the ranch. I knew I had her now. She wasn't just embarrassing herself, she was dragging her HOA crew into the mud with her, literally and figuratively. And just as I suspected, the cracks in her little empire were beginning to show. The next chapter in this saga wouldn't be fought with fences or mud trap. It would be fought with paperwork, public opinion, and a little help from a few friends who had finally had enough of Queen Karen and her off-road reign. The following Monday morning, I was feeding the pigs when my phone buzzed with a dozen messages. At first, I thought it might be weather alerts or spam, but when I opened the first text and saw a blurry screenshot of Karen half buried in a trench, face contorted mid-scream, I nearly dropped the feed bucket from laughter. The video had gone viral. Someone from the HOA ride, probably the teenager who fell in the muck, had uploaded the GoPro footage to a local forum, captioned, "When HOA goes wild." Within hours, it was picked up by a meme page, and now Karen's face was everywhere. Her scream had even been turned into a remix. Duke the Pig made a cameo, bell jingling in rhythm. It wasn't just funny. It was a full-blown internet moment. And Karen, the queen of control, had lost the narrative. But instead of laying low and licking her wounds like any reasonable person, she launched a counterattack. By noon, she'd posted a new HOA bulletin claiming she had suffered deliberate targeting on a public trail, and that biological hazards had been intentionally placed to harass community members. She announced a temporary HOA investigation committee, staffed entirely by her, and demanded that all trail-related grievances be sent directly to her inbox. She also made a new rule. All community outdoor events involving ATVs, dirt bikes, or livestock must now be registered with the HOA. It was laughable, except for the fact that she was serious. Some residents began to crack. They were tired of the drama, but others were angry, especially those whose kids had ended up muddy and embarrassed. A few started asking public questions. Where was the proof that the trail was even HOA jurisdiction? Why were they using HOA funds to buy flags, shirts, and drone rentals? And most importantly, why was a pig named Duke more popular than their president? The HOA group chat turned into a battlefield. Karen responded with long-winded paragraphs about community rights, land access agreements that didn't exist, and a vague reference to a pending real estate annexation proposal. The more she wrote, the more unhinged it sounded. I stayed quiet, screenshotting everything. Later that day, I got a knock at the gate. I figured it might be the sheriff, maybe Vince again, but to my surprise, it was someone I didn't recognize at first. A man in his 50s, jeans dusty, boots scuffed, and an amused smile tucked under a handlebar mustache. He introduced himself as Gerald, the local vet, and said he was the guy who passed by during the first Pigsty fiasco and captured part of the chaos on his phone. He'd uploaded a short clip, mostly as a joke. But now, news reporters were calling him for interviews, and a local radio station even offered to bring him on air with the rancher whose pigs defend their land. He chuckled and said, "I figured I'd better come meet the Star General before this turns into a full-scale movie." We talked for a while, mostly laughing about how wild things had gotten. Gerald mentioned that public sentiment was shifting. The community was split between Karen loyalists and everyone else who was either entertained or horrified. He said if I wanted to really end this, now was the time to go on the offensive. He wasn't wrong. The tide had turned, and the more Karen talked, the more foolish she looked. But I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted peace, and I wanted my land respected. So I decided to escalate things in the calmest, most professional way possible. I sent a cease and desist letter through a real lawyer this time, complete with photos, footage, GPS maps, property surveys, and highlighted HOA boundaries. Everything that proved the trail wasn't just not public, it was never even adjacent to HOA-managed land. The cherry on top? A notarized affidavit from the previous landowner, who confirmed the trail had always been private. I sent a copy to Karen's personal mailbox and a digital copy to the HOA email list. I didn't add commentary. I let the facts do the talking. 3 days later, HOA members began resigning. First it was Rick, the GoPro guy, who claimed he had other commitments. Then Susan, who had been on the parade but pretended she hadn't. Then another woman I didn't even know by name. The resignations came fast, and each one posted a farewell message, subtly blaming recent decisions and leadership direction. Karen, of course, tried to keep face. She claimed they were just rotating in new members. But even her die-hard supporters were growing quiet. That Friday, something even stranger happened. A delivery truck pulled into my driveway and dropped off a large box addressed to the Hero Rancher. Inside was a framed photo of Duke with a medal around his neck and a thank-you note from a group of residents who had unofficially named themselves the Anti-Karen Coalition. They apologized for her behavior and included a gift card to the local feed store. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on the porch. Duke, for his part, just rolled in the mud and nuzzled the box. Of course, Karen wasn't done. Her final attempt to reclaim power came in the form of a town hall meeting she organized at the community center. She invited residents, reporters, and local officials, hoping to paint herself as a visionary leader persecuted by a hostile landowner. I didn't attend, but several of my neighbors did. One of them, Tony, a retired firefighter and no fan of nonsense, called me afterward and described it as a cross between a bad reality show and a meltdown. Karen tried to run a slideshow, but the projector glitched and flashed a still of her stuck in the trench. Someone laughed, and that set off a chain reaction of chuckles she couldn't recover from. When she tried to silence the crowd, someone played the Pig remix ringtone. She ended the meeting early, red-faced, declaring, "This community deserves better than disrespect and sabotage." And maybe for once we all agreed with her, because the next day, a petition started circulating calling for Karen's removal as HOA president. It hit over 100 signatures in 24 hours. More residents came forward with stories of misuse, bullying, and petty fines. One man said she fined him for using off-white blinds. Another claimed she demanded he repaint his garden gnome because it clashed with the HOA's seasonal aesthetic. The stories poured out like floodgates had opened. I stayed quiet, but I watched everything. The war she'd started on my land had triggered a rebellion she couldn't contain. Karen, once the self-declared empress of the subdivision, was now scrambling. She tried to defend herself, but the internet had already chosen its favorite character. It wasn't her. It was Duke, the mudslinging pig with better leadership instincts than half the board. There were stickers now. T-shirts. One guy even airbrushed Duke's face onto his truck door with the words, "Trail Boss," underneath. The HOA's authority was crumbling, not because of me, but because Karen couldn't let go of her pride. By the end of the week, her front yard had become a silent protest zone. People walked their dogs past her house and stared. Some left fake trail maps in her mailbox, pointing to imaginary pig zones. A kid taped a sign to her door that said, "Caution, wild boars have rights too." The HOA newsletter that month didn't come from her. It came from the remaining members, short, polite, and notably missing her name from any section. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. But that evening, as I watched Duke snoozing in the mud with his medal still around his neck, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had gone to war with the wrong ranch, the wrong man, and definitely the wrong pigs. And as the sun dipped low over the trail, I knew one thing for sure. This fight was no longer about fences or property lines. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to bulldoze it with entitlement. And thanks to one persistent pig and a little patience, the tide had finally turned. A week after the town hall disaster, Karen tried to disappear from public view, but the internet wouldn't let her. Every time she tried to post something on the HOA page, people replied with oinks, gifs of pigs in sunglasses, or links to the viral video now titled, "The Queen of Muck, Karen's Trail of Tears." Even her own board members stopped defending her. The HOA Facebook group turned into a roast pit, where neighbors shared their grievances and memes flourished. One local even made a parody video pretending to be Karen giving a press conference while standing knee-deep in a kiddie pool full of mud. It hit 20,000 views overnight. Karen's carefully crafted image of suburban sophistication had crumbled into a joke. But this was more than public embarrassment. Karen wasn't done swinging. She was just reloading. That became clear when I got served a legal notice at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. A courier in a suit pulled into my driveway, looking like he'd never walked on dirt in his life, and handed me a thick envelope. Karen was suing me for malicious endangerment, emotional distress, and environmental sabotage. She accused me of intentionally rerouting the trail to trap her, of weaponizing my pigs, and of launching a public humiliation campaign. According to the paperwork, she was demanding $50,000 in damages and an immediate trail easement granting her access. I sat on the porch with the envelope in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, reading through it while Duke napped in the shade, completely unaware that he'd just been named in a lawsuit as a violent farm animal. The lawyer she hired was a guy named Tad Blitzen. The name sounded like he belonged in a used car commercial, and after reading the first few pages of his arguments, I could see why. His language was flowery, exaggerated, and full of half-baked legal threat. He referred to Karen as a pillar of the community, and me as a rogue rancher obstructing progress. It was nonsense, but I took it seriously. I forwarded everything to my attorney, Hannah, who had a reputation for handling land disputes with the precision of a surgeon and the bite of a cattle dog. When she saw the footage, the trail cam data, the HOA letter signed by Karen, and the GPS maps, she smiled and said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Court day arrived 2 weeks later. The hearing was in a modest courthouse just outside of town. It wasn't a big case, but Karen had managed to create a local media circus. A reporter from the county paper showed up. A podcast host wanted to livestream commentary. Even the vet Gerald popped in, wearing a hat that said Hog Justice. I walked into the courtroom in jeans, a clean button-up, and my old ranch boot. Karen arrived 30 minutes early, wearing all black like she was at a funeral, flanked by Tad and a rolling cart of files. She tried to avoid eye contact, but the moment she sat down and spotted Duke's face on someone's t-shirt in the gallery, she turned red as a pepper. The judge assigned to the case was an older woman named Miriam Douglas, known for her no-nonsense attitude and love of horses. She raised an eyebrow at the stack of accusations, then looked at me and asked plainly, "You got pigs?" I nodded. She said, "Good. I hate chicken people." The courtroom chuckled. Karen didn't. Her lawyer stood and delivered a dramatic opening speech about psychological trauma, property rights, and the emotional scars Karen had suffered at the hands of my livestock. He even tried to play the viral video in slow motion, pointing out every time Karen expressed visible distress. Judge Douglas watched for about a minute before saying, "That pig's adorable. Continue." Then it was Hannah's turn. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't dramatize. She just presented. Photo after photo of broken fences, signed notices, emails from the HOA, GPS trail overlays, a notarized property survey showing where my land began and where the HOA's borders ended. Then she dropped the final piece. The HOA's own bylaw stating they had no authority over adjoining private property. Judge Douglas looked at Karen and asked if she'd ever read that clause. Karen mumbled something about trusting Tad. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So you ignored property lines, trespassed repeatedly, endangered livestock, and filmed it all?" Karen tried to pivot. "He created the trap, he knew I'd use it." Judge Douglas blinked slowly, then said, "That's like breaking into someone's house and blaming them for the furniture arrangement." The courtroom nearly lost it. A few snorts of laughter echoed through the room. Gerald held up a small plush pig like a trophy. Karen stood up and shouted, "I have rights. This is community land." Judge Douglas replied coolly, "No ma'am, it's his ranch. Your community ends at the fence." She dismissed the case. Not only that, she ordered Karen to pay my legal fees and issued a restraining order banning her from entering or attempting to access my property in any way. Tad tried to protest, but she shut him down with one glance. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. I didn't say much. Just thanked the judge, shook a few hands, and posed for a picture with Duke, who Gerald had brought along in the back of his truck. Karen, on the other hand, stormed out the side entrance, pulling her coat over her head like a scandalized celebrity. She wouldn't be going quietly, but her credibility had taken a lethal hit. I figured that might be the end of it, but the fallout was just beginning. The HOA members who had remained silent during her reign started to act. They called for an emergency vote to suspend Karen from the board. It wasn't even close. 87% voted to remove her. Someone leaked internal emails that showed she had been using HOA funds for personal errands, including ATV maintenance and drone rentals. The finance officer quit, claiming she had been pressured to falsify expense reports. A formal audit began the next week. Karen was toast. To celebrate the end of the saga, the community hosted a barbecue. It wasn't officially anti-Karen, but the invitation included a cartoon of a pig in sunglasses with the words, "Long live the trail boss." I showed up with Duke in tow, now wearing a custom bandana that said, "Not today, Karen." The place was packed. Families brought lawn chairs and crockpot. Someone set up a mechanical bull. The local radio station played country hits, and there were cupcakes shaped like little mud puddles. At one point, a group of kids asked me if they could ride Duke. I laughed and said he preferred to ride solo. The best part wasn't the food or the music. It was watching people who'd been intimidated for years finally laugh again. They talked openly about how Karen had fined them, threatened them, and ruled through fear. One woman said she'd been too afraid to hang a wreath on her door because Karen didn't approve of seasonal clutter. Another man confessed he'd been hiding his recycling bin behind a tree for 3 years. There was a release in the air, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled at once. Toward the end of the night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, someone raised a toast to the rancher and his pigs. I lifted my lemonade, grateful but not boastful. I didn't need a crown or a microphone. I just wanted peace and my land respected. And now, finally, it was. The trail was quiet again. The pigs were happy. And Karen? She was no longer queen of anything but her own lawn. As I walked home under the stars, Duke trotting beside me with his bell gently jingling, I thought about how ridiculous the whole thing had been. All of it, over a dirt trail and one woman's obsession with power. But sometimes it takes a little mud and a whole lot of patience to remind people where the boundaries really are. And thanks to a few cameras, a good lawyer, and one very charismatic pig, the message had been received loud and clear. 3 weeks after the barbecue, the once feisty, flag-waving HOA that had tried to declare war on my ranch looked like it had been through a political hurricane. Karen's resignation from the board wasn't so much an announcement as it was a silent retreat. One day her name was plastered on every HOA email, and the next, it vanished without a trace. No farewell post. No public statement. Just gone. Some say she packed up and moved out of the neighborhood altogether. Others claim she was still there, hiding behind blackout curtains and walking her dog only after dark. Either way, nobody missed her. The HOA, under new leadership, immediately set out to repair the damage. Not just with me, but with every neighbor who had suffered under Karen's rule. The new board president, a woman named Angela, reached out to me personally. She drove out to the ranch, wore boots like she meant it, and handed me a formal letter apologizing for the previous administration's actions. It was the first time anyone from the HOA treated my land like something other than a playground. Angela asked if there was anything they could do to make peace. I told her I didn't need favors, I just needed boundaries. Literal, physical, visible boundaries. Fences respected. Gates left closed. And no more rogue ATVs pretending my livestock trail was a racetrack. She agreed immediately and offered to cover half the cost of a new barrier wall along the back edge of the neighborhood. I accepted, and within days, Construction began on a reinforced split-rail fence complete with a clear property demarcation sign and a couple of cameras of my own. While the physical line was being rebuilt, the neighborhood itself began rebuilding its culture. It was slow at first. The fear Karen had instilled over the years didn't vanish overnight. Some folks still tiptoed around HOA policies like they were landmines. But over time, things relaxed. People started putting out seasonal decorations again. A neighbor who had been fined for having wind chimes now had 3 sets playing in harmony. Another painted their front door bright blue in open defiance of Karen's beige-only color mandate. Nobody fined them. Nobody cared. Kids rode bikes on sidewalks again without being photographed and reported. The change was like rain after a drought, gentle but undeniable. Meanwhile, my ranch finally returned to normal. The pigs stopped reacting to engine sounds with excitement, and Duke resumed his usual routine of napping in the shade and occasionally investigating the compost bin for banana peels. Every once in a while, someone would stop by the fence, peer across it, and point at Duke, whispering as if they were meeting a celebrity. I didn't mind. He'd earned it. I even caught a reporter sneaking a photo once, trying to get a shot for a follow-up piece titled, "The Pig Who Dethroned the HOA Queen." I let them take it on the condition they spell his name right and don't ask him to pose. One Saturday morning, as I was repairing a loose board near the chicken coop, Angela returned. This time, she had a folder in her hand and a sheepish expression. She explained that during the HOA's internal audit, they'd discovered a stash of previously unfiled complaints Karen had hidden away. Dozens of them. Residents had submitted issues about her abuse of power, misuse of HOA funds, even complaints about her trespassing on other private property, not just mine. Karen had buried them. The new board wanted to issue a public record correcting the narrative and clearing the names of anyone who'd ever been unfairly fined or penalized. She asked if I wanted to submit a statement. I told her I already had. The whole mess, from the trail to the courtroom, had been one long statement. But I appreciated the gesture. Angela nodded and admitted that most of the neighborhood was embarrassed. They'd let Karen operate unchecked for too long, mostly because she had a talent for making people feel small and isolated. That was her power, dividing people and hiding behind rules she bent to her will. But now that they'd seen what standing up to her looked like, more neighbors were finding their voices again. That afternoon, something happened I never expected. A group of residents from the neighborhood came to the ranch with a gift. It wasn't a fancy item or a bribe. It was a handmade wooden sign carved with the words "Trail Boss Ranch." They'd etched a cartoon of Duke in the corner, complete with his little bell collar. It was simple, but meaningful. One of the men, a quiet guy who'd once been fined for building a treehouse for his grandson, looked me in the eye and said, "Thanks for doing what the rest of us were too scared to do." I didn't have much to say. Just nodded, took the sign, and promised to mount it near the gate where the mess all began. The irony of it all didn't escape me. I hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. I just wanted people off my land. I wanted peace. But somehow, by standing my ground, I'd helped the neighborhood rediscover its own backbone. And Karen, in her obsession to dominate everything in sight, had been the one to unite people against her. The Pigsty ambush, the legal showdown, the viral video, all of it added up to something I couldn't have planned if I tried. A turning point. For me. For them. For the ranch. In the final days of that saga, I received a certified letter in the mail from Karen. It was brief. No apologies. No admissions. Just a cold line that read, "Due to continued public harassment and false narratives, I will be relocating. This community is no longer a safe place for visionary leadership." I stared at it for a minute, folded it neatly, and tossed it into the compost bin. The pigs didn't care. Neither did I. Weeks passed. Then a month. Life settled. The fence was up, the trail untouched, and the only tire tracks on it were mine. The HOA stopped sending me letters. The new board handled disputes with transparency. And the air just felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. like someone had cracked open the window after years of staleness. The chickens laid better. The goats stopped getting spooked. Even the rooster, who had crowed nervously every time an ATV passed, now did his morning routine in peace. And Duke? He enjoyed his fame with grace. He never got arrogant or demanding, just kept to his wallows and followed me when it was feeding time. But every now and then, when the wind shifted and a distant engine rumbled on the horizon, he'd raise his head, bell jingling, as if to say, "Let them try." And I'd smile, knowing no one would. Because the ranch was defended. Not with barbed wire. Not with weapons. But with truth, patience, and the unlikely courage of a pig who just wanted a snack but ended up making history. As the sun set on one of those quiet evenings, casting a golden hue over the hills, I stood by the fence and looked toward the trail. It was quiet, undisturbed, and absolutely mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't worry about what came next. Because I knew that whatever it was, I was ready. And so was Duke. The trail had changed, the neighborhood had changed, and maybe even I had changed. But one thing would never change again. No one, absolutely no one, was ever going to turn my land into their personal playground. Not while Duke was on duty. And not while I was still standing.